And hello again, boys and girls. Welcome back to the channel. Of course, it's your host, Marley Startled. And today I thought I'd do a bit of a general tutorial for Unity Command 2. I know I've been playing this quite a lot. I thought maybe you guys would be quite interested in playing yourselves, or if you're perhaps already bought the game, you're trying to understand how the basic mechanics work, then of course you can take a look at this and use it as a reference point. I'm no means an expert. I can just about do most of the campaigns on normal. I have never beat any on hard or classic, and I only beat Moscow 41, or wanted to beat Moscow 41 on easy. So these will be basic generalized tips for you. They're not going to be elite how-tos and how to complete every scenario. So this will be covering mostly persistent campaign, the persistent campaign mechanics, and then the actual battle mechanics itself. So here we have our persistent campaign. So this is the start of the Victory in the West persistent campaign, and now we'll explain some of the details. So on the top of the screen we have prestige, and prestige is sort of your points, your in-game currency. From this you can use prestige to upgrade units on the field, purchase cards which will aid you in battle, or upgrade your HQs. Now upgrading your HQs will grant them more special abilities and more potential tools in your arsenal to improve your situations in the battles. Now from my own perspective, I've generally not upgraded HQs in most of my games unless told to by the game itself. For example, on the push across the Rhine, when the game tells you to invest so you can get naval invasions or river invasions or assault crossings, that's when I tend to invest in those HQs, but I generally see it as a waste of points. And of course see here you've got different bonuses. So if I invest at 25, I get extra movement speed, which generally makes it easier for me to move my HQs further in a single turn. Of course, you've got other mechanics such as the transfer steps, which allows you to move more than one step. And of course, you've got security units, which allows you to defend your HQs. Again, these are things you don't really need in the battles. I really wouldn't recommend upgrading these. This comes as default, so you've got your deploy steps and so on, but we'll go into more detail about these mechanics later. Equally, we have our cards. So what are cards? So cards are certain bonuses that you can use in a particular scenario. Some cards are persistent, which means that you'll get it back if your card survives or your unit survives at the end of a conference, which conference covers normally a period of scenarios and a new conference starts, or it may be a one-use shot. So you see here that playing on normal you get one free card. Now this is random per conference, per campaign, and so what you can do if you're feeling a bit cheesy is restart the campaign if you don't like your starting cards. So of course you've got your B-26 bomber, which allows you to do extra damage to enemy units, potentially knock out in placed units, and if you use enough of them, shift and do extra damage to potentially kill enemy units as well. Of course, you've also got the bombardment, which allows you to destroy units that are on the coastline, though it can be a bit finicky on some scenarios, which again is very useful when you're doing your naval invasion maps, or you've got to take a coastal town or port. Of course, you have your C47 Supply, which is also another very useful tool. It does allow you to supply one unit per turn for up to 3 turns, which can be supplied by air. This is extremely useful when you do breakthroughs and you're worried about your flanks, and it gives you the extra flexibility to keep on pushing forward without having to stop and stall your offensive. But of course it's extremely limited, so bear in mind that you'll only be able to sustain really one good unit, maybe 2 good units maximum, before it fails. And again, it's only really a time buying strategy. It's not something you can use consistency. This is not my favorite card. This effectively allows you to buy elite replacements. This means that when we go to scenarios, you'll be able to see where you can buy replacements, and also put in reinforcements, and this allows you to buy extra elite steps, although these are very expensive, and generally I don't tend to use this card because this seems to be a bit of a filler. And of course you end up with things such as Marine cards or Polish paratrooper cards or the 101st Airborne cards. These are extremely useful power drop cards which are persistent, so if this unit doesn't die in battle, when you use it for that scenario when the next conference starts, you'll be able to get that card back. This means if you can build up a lot of these paratrooper cards, you can be in a really strong position to just dominate in certain scenarios by overriding the enemy supply lines. The only negative is, of course, if you lose that card and that unit gets wiped, you're not going to get it back. There are also other cards such as Sabotage Cards, which are very useful at destroying bridges and destroying supply dumps, which will mean that you can potentially starve the enemy or prevent the enemy withdrawing, allowing you to sort of starve and make it a lot easier in certain scenarios. Sabotage cards are very situational, so generally I would highly recommend mostly focusing on your B-26, your strategic bomber cards, which is another card which allows you to strategic bombing, and of course your bombardment cards and your paratroopers. This is more situational and the sabotage is more situational. Up here you have your score. So your score is your current campaign score. It's just a general sort of bragging rights really. Yeah, the score has no real effect on the game. And of course the reset if you are soft locked, because each campaign is persistent. So in each scenario, your units that you use in that scenario, if they were historically used in a future scenario such as D-Day or Husky, they will carry over with the same experience, the same equipment and the same strength. This means that if you lose a lot of troops at the start of the campaign, or the start of the scenario, or you lose a lot of strength in these units, you may potentially soft lock yourself because you run out of prestige to reinforce them, and as a result this mechanic here is to sort of stop that soft lock, allowing you to go back to the conference and redo the scenarios from scratch. But it's a good thing to have. Alternatively, you can just restart a scenario, and once you restart a scenario and replay that scenario, you'll be given bonuses such as pioneer units and of course airstrikes. So here we'll take our B-26 bomber and we'll start our first scenario. Here's just a bit of general view so you can see the different strategic maps and go from there. But it's just more, the game will show you what scenario to play first. So this will give you a general explanation of what HQs are being used for this battle, as well as the number of turns you require to do it. Equally, on the bottom right, you'll see sometimes that there are alternative objectives which can either improve your chances in the later missions, or will allow you to open up alternative historical scenarios. For example, if I breach the Gothic line in Italy and complete that alt history scenario, or complete that alternative objective, I will get the potential option at the next conference to change history and see what would happen if the Allies kept pushing into Italy and tried to end the war early. Now, these alternative historical scenarios are generally harder because they cost prestige to use and will often require you being weaker on another front, or are generally geographically or strategically harder to break. So bear in mind that if you're doing rather poorly up until that point, you may not want to invest in that alternative scenario. But now, let's get into our meat and potatoes of the actual game. So here we have Wadiakra. It's the first scenario of the Victory in the West campaign, and it's a generally fairly easy one. And this of course covers the collapse of North Africa for the Axis. So you'll get your scenario briefing, which will give you general information about the scenario. Sometimes you can't trust that information because of course it'll be historically sometimes trying to mislead you, but for the most part it gives you just a bit of setting understanding, which you can continue on. So on our top left we have our menu. If you feel like the game is going badly, once you start the scenario you can surrender. You can also change the objective, so if you're used to playing the game and you just want scorecards, you can select that option. I prefer using this option because of course if you select these you will see the objectives. So you see up here our main objectives and the prestige we will get for taking them within the turn limit. So generally in what difficulty you're playing at, you'll have a certain number of turns to take the objective. So this is the total amount of turns. On the top left you have that scenario, so I have 9 turns to complete the scenario. But if I can complete these objectives within the time frame, I will get bonus prestige, which means that I will be able to use that prestige to buy more units later on and will aid me in battle. Here we have our bonus objective. So for example, for the pass, which will give you a varying degree of resources. For example, this will give me 20 more prestige. This will allow me to upgrade my HQ. This of course may give me a card, maybe a bomber card or a truck card, and equally this is the same, but you're never really quite sure what card you will get. And of course you have certain time limits. What I would advise you to do is take a look when you do start each scenario about what turn the game expects you to take said objectives, because this would normally be a good indicator for you of where you need to push. So for example, Vax wants to be taken by turn 4, so it's highly unlikely my main thrust should be in the north. bearing in mind I have to take Infidelaville by turn 7. So it appears what my units are the closest. Well, these units, there's tanks and that, so it's expected that I will probably have to break through here to reach the objective. Of course, bonus objectives are good to have, but not the end of the world. Depending on how well you're doing, it may be a good idea to abandon taking these objectives. But generally speaking, you want to get as many objectives as you can early on to get as many points as you can for the later levels. So we have our prestige here. This will tell us what we can buy and what we can't. And of course we have different units, skip units. I very rarely use these. If there's a unit I don't really want to use, I'll put it on a supply hub, but it gives you the option to go to different units and tell units not to be selected. So for example, if I have this unit here and he's going to be useless, I have no intention of using it, I can put him there and tell him to sleep. And we have the undo action, a very useful action. So if you put down a supply hub in the wrong place, or you move a unit which you didn't want to move, then of course you can undo this, and rather than just accepting a catastrophic collapse in that turn. There's caveats to this. For example, if your unit meets a new enemy or gets into combat, you may not be able to undo that turn. So here we'll have our supply information, so we can add supply if we have the supply card, and our level of supply. Different scenarios will give you different starting levels of supply. Now this means that if we click V on our keyboard, we will see our supply. Now you see here this big old pale bar. This is our chance of not getting supply. So if we have a low supply area, say we're doing Husky and we have a 50% supply, this means that half of this bar will be red. That means that there's a 50% chance that any units on that bar may not get supplied that turn. This can be improved in some cases by increasing supply dumps. Alternatively, it can be improved by taking certain objectives which will improve your overall supply. On our top we have our supply network. So if we click here, we can then assess our supply. So in Unity of Command 2, supply is extremely important because it was what will allow you to keep on pushing and keep on fighting. And because it's a turn-based timed sort of scenario, every single turn counts, and you cannot afford your units to be unable to fight due to lack of supply. So generally speaking, there's three sort of main infrastructural points. There is your railways, which will normally carry supply hubs up and supply up and along these. These will often bring supply to one or two tiles next to that rail line. There's also paths, which will generally not take supply from the edge of the map, but will allow you to put down supply dumps. And you have roads. Now roads are slightly better than paths or tracks because supply normally carries longer on those, but again will not transport supply from the edge of the map to the start. So you can see here, this is supplying supply all along these routes, and then this is a general supply as a result of potentially these HQs or these supply dumps. So if we select the supply dump, we can see where it's currently supplying and how many tiles or hexes our supply can go. So in this scenario, this supply will carry on for 6 more hexes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if that path to this supply hub is not interrupted, any units here will be supplied. Now if we make this smaller, you can see here that this area has now gone red. That's because the supply hub is no longer supplying it because we've closed down that supply hub. This means any units on those red tiles will now start suffering supply issues. So a unit with supply issues, the first turn they're without supply, they will be able to continue to fight without any issue. The second turn they will not be able to fight, but they will still be able to move, and the third turn they completely become combat ineffective. This means that you're sort of on a time constraint to resupply them or move them to supply areas, otherwise making them extremely vulnerable to counterattack or risk of being ineffective and starving. So in this case, for example, if I wanted to upgrade the supply area, I could select this and scroll up. You can see here I have my number of spare trucks available, as well as of course things such as numbers of trucks being taken out of the theatre and a potential number of trucks going back into the theatre. So I can upgrade this, and you see that I now have 0 trucks available. I bring this down, I have 3 trucks available. So if we just bring this to 1, we'll bring it to 2 for now and see where it goes and see what happens from there. Now on the right hand side you have some scenarios where you'll get reinforcements. Normally the game will tell you that reinforcements are coming, but when you get reinforcements, you simply select this, select your reinforcement, and then it should appear on the map where you can deploy it. Places where sometimes you cannot deploy them are in the cases of a militia because you haven't taken that tile yet, or potentially because you've got troops on that tile so the new units can't come in. So it's a good idea to check when you're going to get new reinforcements on where they're going to arrive to sort of plan out your strategy. HQs, again, this will tell you where HQ is going to be deploying the map. Again, used in mostly like Husky or D-Day. Very important you do get HQs on the map because they will allow you to use your HQ special abilities. Potential enemy reinforcements, and of course potential enemy HQs. You also have different target information, so you can click this if you want to see the enemy supply, or you can hold B. Now the B key will show you the enemy supply, and it's a good way of planning your strategy. So in this case we know that there's a supply hub here which the enemy is using to supply all these tanks in this sector. So a good idea, a good strategy would be to punch through and either secure this tile to completely starve these enemies, or punch along the tracks to stop the enemy being supplied. Now either punch along from the north or punch from the south, it doesn't really matter, but as long as we can cut them off from that rail line, it doesn't matter if we take a supply hub, because that supply hub is being fed by this rail line, that supply will no longer work. So if I take this tile, this means that supply hub no longer has a link to this end of the map or the supply center, and this means that supply hub will stop working, so I don't have to take the supply hub. Now there are bonuses to taking a supply hub, so in some cases if you see an enemy undefended supply hub and your troops running out of supply, you can send your tanks or your infantry to take that supply hub, and then your troops will be supplied for that turn. So sometimes in say the Blitzkrieg DLC or the Barbarossa DLC where you're gunning it, it may be an idea or strategy to run without supply and hope to capture the enemy's supply hubs, and that way you'll be able to keep on feeding your attack. Of course we've got terrain view, something I very rarely use, but something you can use if you want. So terrain view will tell you things like deserts, mountains, so on, but visually speaking you can normally tell what's going to be easy to take and what's not. So of course it's going to be very difficult to travel over these mountains, so you probably don't want to send your tanks over them because you're going to waste a turn. Equally, if you've got infantry on these mountains and you get attacked, you're going to be better defended, whereas of course if the infantry themselves are on the mountains, it may be harder to take. And the same with cities as well. Of course if you see cities, it's going to be hard to push the enemy off, especially if they're dug in. Weather, again, it's not very apparent, you can't do much about the weather, but inside the Barbarossa DLC it's like, oh, it's starting to rain, but again, it doesn't really matter. And movement view, where you can move and where you can't. But again, something I very rarely use. So zonal control, so certain enemies will have zones of control. So if I break this troop and this troop wasn't behind it, I would have to move a troop forward to secure that zone of control, then move another troop forward to secure this zone of control, and then once I'm past the enemy zone of control, I can start moving tanks around the flank. But of course that is dependent on certain reinforcement steps or certain reinforcement units or certain specialized units, and of course certain scenarios. On the bottom left we have our cards which we cannot use yet, and on our right we have our HQs. So if we select this HQ here, we can see the HQ's general field of control. So any troop that is in this field of control will be able to use that HQ's special abilities. So in this case they'll be able to use suppressive fire, emergency resupply, and so on. Any troops that are outside that field of control will not be able to use those special abilities. So it's important if you're pushing with certain specialized units that you've got HQs behind them to make sure they can use those special abilities. Equally, they also have the ability to deploy steps, which means that if you lose troops or troops are destroyed, sometimes the stragglers will come back to the HQ, and then in the next scenario, in the same scenario, you can redeploy these into your units. Or you can use the reserves and start buying units with prestige. So of course we can buy more infantry steps if we want to by clicking on these sort of units and seeing where we can deploy, or we can buy US infantry or other aspects, but we'll talk more about that when we go and talk about our general push in the bottom. As a rule, you want to be moving your HQs as close to the front as possible, because it will give you more flexibility in using those emergency resupplies and using those special abilities, and it means you just have to worry less about constantly moving your troops around. Equally, the same can be said with your supply dumps, but bear in mind that the enemy can take supply dumps, so you've got to factor in, do you really want your supply dumps too close? Now, as a rule, I tend to protect my supply dumps, so I generally don't have to worry about that, but that's why sometimes it's a good idea just to close these down and put them closer to the front, depending on your situation. So let's talk about our strategy. So if we select our HQ down south, which is the 8th, we can see our zone of control. Now, we have no reinforcements we can apply, but we can build steps. Now, in most scenarios, apart from Moscow 41, your tanks will be your main weapon of war. They will be your thrusting weapons. And so it's very important that you upgrade your tanks first, or upgrade your units that you want to push with or you need for that scenario to win. So the certain upgrades we can apply is, of course, more steps. So if we select this unit here, we can see the number of steps it has. Now, a step just means strength. Now you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. Now I can add another step which makes it more versatile and more likely to survive combat, but it may result in a loss of experience. Now, a loss of experience will lead to sort of combat penalties and generally a weaker unit, but it also means that more steps makes it a more survivable unit. So for example, if I had a 1-step unit and it was attacked and it got suppressed and then it was attacked again, I would lose that unit. Whereas of course having more steps means that I've got more flexibility and I can keep on a persistent fight for longer. So as a rule, I tend to have my strongest units with the most steps, with the highest upgrades, because I need them to push and gain that veterancy. So in this case, we're going to select the 8th, and we're going to select some armor. And then we're going to use certain other tools. So we can upgrade our armor infantry, or we can give them special units. So we've got things like artillery, which allow us to use suppressive fire, engineers, which are extremely powerful in most of the DLCs, which will generally give you bonuses attacking entrenched units, or will give you bonuses crossing rivers or attacking across bridges. And so engineers are very important to have in a lot of your units. So if we select engineers for this target, and then of course we can upgrade commandos. Again, you can think about different complexities, but as a rule, the more expensive the reinforcement step, the better it is for most scenarios. But my biggest push, I would say, is use engineers and use strong artillery pieces, and you'll normally not go very far wrong. Of course, then you start buying the cheaper stuff and so on. And now we've upgraded using a prestige to buy all these units. So with this done, we can take a look around with WSD. You can also revolve with Q&E as well. We can now take a look at our scenario. So you can see here, our big push will be to encircle this objective, then just a general punch through, a feed just to get points really, and then a general punch through to take the Duke Pass. Now I may not get this perfect first time because there is some RNG involved, but we're just going to use this as a tutorial example. Also I'm a filthy casual, but hey ho. Can I go back to normal? Please, no. Good enough. So on the top right is our end turn preparation, so you can now go into the battle phase. So we are now in the battle phase, and of course we can start taking into account. We have the enemy HQ here. Now if we take enemy HQs, we can potentially take prisoners or get information. So I'm going to use my card, which means I will get a second bomber, and then we'll see where we can push. So previously we were talking about steps. You can see here we have our specialist steps and our general strength. Now you have sort of two types of health. You've got number of steps, which means how long they can remain in a fight, and general overall strength. And you also have suppression. So when you get into combat with a unit, that you may get suppressed, and that means one step is grayed out. This means that you've temporarily lost your unit's strength for that turn. However, if they are resupplied next turn, they will go back to normal strength. This leads to situations where you may be overzealous with your tanks and lose or be very suppressed, and then the enemy counterattacks and wipes out your tanks, because for every suppressed step you have, it acts as though you didn't have that level of strength. So if we could take an example, we just attack this. I didn't lose a step. And you can see here our combat values are 1 to 1, which means we may lose a step fighting this. Which we did. Now we see here 3 to 0. So it's probably a good idea to bomb it. You can see here now this unit has now got a suppressed step. You can see it's paled out. That means it will act as though it is completely defenseless with no strength. So now by attacking this I can get 1 to 1 and punch across. You can see here that both of my specialist steps are suppressed. It means they will no longer be calculated into combat for that phase until they are resupplied. I can now bring my tanks through. You probably don't want to be doing this normally. You really want to be trading with 1 to 0, but this is an example. So normally you want to be trading with like 0 to 1, 0 to 3, and you're just going to spend time slowly wearing down the enemy. But in this case, I'm just going to push over. See here, that's a 1 to 1. But sometimes it can be random, and it generally, if it's random, then generally speaking, well, there's some RNG involved in the game where it will give you the potential outcome, but it may throw a curveball. So if you've got a 1 to 1, sometimes you'll lose 2 units, or sometimes you lose no units, and so that's something you've got to factor in. So I'm going to move around this unit here. The reason why I'm doing this is because I want to try and encircle these units before they have a chance to withdraw. See, I've got 2 suppressed tiles which will be resupplied next turn because they are in resupply, but this unit will not be resupplied next turn because they've got a little red bar. So the next thing we can talk about is special abilities. So because our HQ is nearby, we can do a number of things. One of the things we can do is destroy bridges. This is a very rare tool you're going to be used because most of the time you'll be on the offensive. Destroying bridges is not a good idea if you're trying to cross them, but you have that potential to do it. The second is repairing bridges. Now, in order to repair a bridge, you must have both sides of the bridge clear. So often you will have to push the enemy off the tile or the enemy defending the other side of the bridge before you can repair it. Now, some scenarios will start with your units across a broken bridge, and so it's important that you check to see which bridges are damaged at the start of each scenario and repair them, because if you don't, you may go a turn without supply and your troops may be counterattacked and lost, because it takes 1 turn from the point of being the command being issued for that bridge to be resupplied, or that bridge to be repaired. And if that bridge is repaired, then supply can of course move across it. And of course you can build new bridges, or pontoon bridges. Now pontoon bridges will allow you to cross where again the enemy is defending it and not defending the other side of the bank, and again will take 1 turn to occur. And this one we have emergency supply. So if your HQ is within a unit's reach that is unsupplied, you can use emergency supply to resupply that unit. Which that means that the unit can once again continue fighting, and also some of its steps will be reinforced, and potentially some of its elite steps. So one of the few mechanics you can do is put your HQ on the farthest reach of your supply line, as long as it's protected, mind you, because it can be taken by the enemy. And then as long as this tank is close enough to that HQ, then of course it can be resupplied. So in this case we have the second, which is over here, but sadly cannot be resupplied just yet because I've moved it. Again, another point you've got to make is that if you move a tile, move a HQ, you cannot use those abilities this turn. However, I don't need to use those abilities this turn because this unit is still unsupplied. It will be out of supply next turn unless I put down, say, another HQ like this, and then I can of course resupply it, unless of course it is cut off. So if the enemy decides to cut off this tank, it means that there will no longer be in the path of supply, and that means it will be out of supply next turn. So if you try and break through there, we take the Duke pass. It allows us to use another truck, which of course means that we have more trucks in our pool. And of course we can just push across like madmen. Now you can see here, this is when it's important to use the things we're discussing here. So if we select this enemy, we can see a little spade tool. It might be a bit small on your screen. Now there's 2 levels of entrenchment. So if you want to entrench a unit, such as this unit here, sometimes, depending on the level of the HQ, you have an option to entrench. That means that unit, when it entrenches, gets bonuses to its defensive stats. So if you have an entrenched unit in a city or a town, it can be very difficult to dislodge. So you have 2 levels. You've got the spade, which is level 1, and then of course you have this weird triangle, which is sort of the 2nd level up, which sometimes can be very difficult to push. Now, if I try to push this, I'm going to get a 2-0, which means at best I may be able to get 1 suppression on this enemy, but I'm going to lose 2 of my steps, or 2 of my unit health. So there's a couple of ways we can dislodge. We can, if we've got an artillery piece, we can use suppressive fire, which will allow us to bombard the enemy position. This may dislodge the enemy's entrenchment, it may kill some units, or it may suppress them, but it's a bit random, so it's something that may or may not work depending on RNG. We also have the no retreat tool, which means these troops will hold to the last, or try to hold to the last. This is something I very rarely use, because if a tank is being pushed, I'd rather it withdraw from that battle to maintain its steps, rather than it hold there and be wiped out. You also have the feint attack. So the feint attack allows you to suppress an enemy position at no cost to your steps. So that means that if I feint attack this unit will lose 1 step to suppression. It won't die, but it will be suppressed. So it's a way you can wear down enemy positions. So if I had 3 units here, I could use feint attack on those 3 units, depending on the level of HQ command points I have. Bring that down to a fully suppressed unit, or a fully suppressed enemy, and then attack it and push it off the tile. And of course you have your feint attack. So your feint attack, or your set piece attack, is sort of a weird one. So it's a bit RNG, but often it's the main tool to push an enemy off a position. This will normally knock out an enemy's entrenchment. It may even push them back and suppress them, but it can backfire on you and lead to the set piece attack failing and your units being massively suppressed. Now the good thing about each of these tools is that, well, with the exception of being suppressive fire and I believe even feint attack, is that you do not lose steps to these abilities. This means that you can use them while conserving your troops' strength. So if I attack this, I would lose 3 units. Now, there's one negative to set piece attack, is that once you use a set piece attack, you cannot move that unit off its tile. So if I was to do a set piece attack here, I would not be able to move it. So if I needed to chain units together to sort of move over here to attack, to move over here to attack, I could not do that because this unit would be stuck in place. Whereas of course suppressive fire, which is a bit more unreliable, allows me to suppress this unit, then withdraw, and then bring another unit into attack. So let's give suppressive fire a go. So you can see here from the suppressive fire, I was able to suppress the enemy twice. This means that hopefully next turn I will be able to push over it and kill it. So if I use a suppression, you can see here I've been suppressed and this guy's been suppressed, and then of course he's got he's going to be weak next turn unless he's resupplied. Now we could have used a feint attack and hoped the best, or we could have crossed the river here. You can see this terrain penalties that for a split second, if I move my troop over, it would tell me that I would get a 2-to-1 attack. That's because of the terrain penalties of this river, meaning that trying to attack across this bridge with this troop would have cost me more than if I'd crossed and attacked in the first place. So with that, our turn finishes. We just moved all our units up. Always a good idea to move our units up. And we wait to see the next turn. Of course, we could just keep bombarding and moving forward, but it's just a risky business, so there's no point doing it. Now, you can only do these special abilities for a certain amount, because if I take a look, where is it? Personal account? No, I don't care about that. HQ supply? No, it is, I believe, over here. Yeah, operations level. Where's the command points? Well, you have a set level of command points. I'm not sure where the command points are, but you can see I've got no more command points, so I can only do this a certain amount before I run out of command points for this turn. So let's end our turn. And this will be the time for the enemy to react. So you can see there I failed to sort of close off and completely collapse the enemy's encirclement, but it shouldn't be the end of the world because there's still a couple of units in there and I've still got some troops ready to push across. And it can be very time sensitive. If you fail one push, then it allows the enemy to withdraw and reinforce and destroy bridges, and so sometimes time is definitely of the essence and you do want to keep on pushing across as much as you can. So in this case, we're going to immediately cut through. You see, by cutting this off, this is no longer supplied. I'm going to move my unit over there. Unit over there. There. And then move it. So what I did there is if you click the space bar with a unit, you can you have two phases. You have the attack phase or the move and attack, which you can do here. So I can move this unit up in attack, or you can use spacebar to do a full move. This will generally allow you to move further. Of course, depending where the enemy is, sometimes your move order will be cancelled, but as a rule, spacebar, if you want to move far very fast, the spacebar and move forward, and that will allow you to go the extra step. Of course, it means I can't attack this turn, but sometimes you don't need to attack, you just need to encircle, so you've got to bear that in mind. So you see here I cannot attack this position because that enemy tank is there. But it's not the end of the world because hopefully we can break through with our other tank units. So because this unit has not been resupplied, or that unit has not come back to full strength, see it's still 2 suppressed. That means of course it's a lot weaker, so instead of losing that those 3 steps, I'll lose 1 step to that 2. Now because it's a starting scenario, there's no real need for me to do that, but if it's a high risk or it's very time sensitive, you may want to just bite the bullet and lose that troop strength. So what should we do? So you can see here this enemy is at Safax. It's only got 1 step. Should be very easy to take. Now, if it was entrenched and a strong unit, it may be very difficult to push that unit off the city. So you can either bomb it and hope for the best, or encircle it. Now bombing is a bit RNG. Sometimes it will kill a unit, sometimes it will suppress it, but there is a risk if you use artillery or bombing on a city, you end up ruining that city, and that gives the enemy massive bonuses to its defense. It's a bit RNG just to make the game a bit more random, but the best thing you can do to avoid that situation is to encircle the city or use the HQ abilities like the feint attack to wear down the strength if you do end up getting into that situation where you do ruin a city. That's one of those things that makes it harder to take a city, but it's a thing you need to take into account. If I bomb these units, will I potentially ruin the city, and will I be able to take it in time? So in this case, we want to use our bombing on this tile. So we ended up doing full suppression, so you can see we couldn't take that, we'd have lost 3 steps. But because now this unit is fully suppressed, it is now acting like a completely defenseless unit. It can no longer attack. This means that now I can just wipe this unit off the face of the map, and I get myself an overrun. Now an overrun allows you to keep on attacking. So for example, because I've overrun that position, I can now either keep attacking, or because I've got more movement points, I can now move forward. So if I move over here, I can cancel and hopefully block the enemy off from moving any further forward or breaking out of the encirclement. Although they still might, it's very dependent. But if we hold B, you can see this entire area has now been cut off from supply, which means that they're going to go 1 turn where they can fight, 1 turn where they can only move, and then 1 turn where they starve. And so it's very important that sometimes the game is not about fighting attritional conflict, it's sometimes about pushing over. You can see here we have these sort of little blue people. They're prisoners or stragglers, which means if you take these, you can sometimes get intel which will help you find out where next enemy positions are, but you generally want to be building up your XP. So after a few turns of lack of supply, these guys will be completely vulnerable. From there, I want to be attacking these units when they're completely vulnerable to gain XP, and also stragglers and prisoners. But we've got to move forward. So we can either move this unit a bit forward, which is very risky because it could be cut off, or we can move off units 4 like so. Or we could even move our tanks up this way and try and get even larger cutoff. So this is where you've got to take into account, what do you want to achieve? Do you want to achieve taking your objectives within a certain time frame, or do you want to achieve encirclement, or do you want to stop the enemy withdrawing, etc, etc, etc. In this case I want to go for the points, so I'm going to move this tank up there, reach that position and move forward. Now, depending on what it says, sometimes some units, some special objectives will ask you to take a position and hold it for the rest of the scenario, or hold it to a certain point. But once you've taken an objective, you no longer need to push. So in this case, I can now withdraw this unit back over here, click the undo button because I want to hold this pass, and then just wait. Because I've moved this unit, I won't be able to entrench it, or because I don't have the ability to entrench it, I won't be able to. I didn't mention rear guard. Rear guard effectively allows you to suppress the enemy, then retreat. So for example, if I had rear guard on here and they attacked me, I could suppress the enemy and withdraw a bit, and this is a good way of delaying enemies, but in most scenarios you don't need to concern yourself with that. So because I got an overrun, I can now think about what I want to do next. It's all about getting the most out of your troop units per turn. So I can either attack this fully suppressed unit and kill it from the battle. Sometimes very good to use against especially very strong tanks. Sometimes you do want to keep on pushing forward as much as you can, just once you've got a unit on the run, because you want to wipe it from the map before it can resupply. Or sometimes you just want to ignore it because you've got more important things to do. So in this case you can see that this guy's on the rail line, so it will be very difficult to keep the supply going, so maybe an idea to push this guy off. So in this case we're going to do a set piece attack, which has suppressed the enemy and also breached it, which now will hopefully allow me to counterattack it. This of course allows them to withdraw, but the big issue of that is now I cannot move this unit, so perhaps it would have been a better idea to use suppressive fire rather than actually using the other the set piece attack. But set piece attack is a more reliable way of destroying entrenchment, which will be most of the time the thing that holds you up from achieving total victory. So now I'm just going to select all my units, see if I can move them any further forward. I cannot. And we'll go on from there. Because we couldn't close off that encirclement, we was able to move that tank over. And because my unit was encircled, it got a cornered trait. So the cornered trait means that your unit, regardless of strength, gets fully suppressed. Now, a unit that's fully suppressed is just extremely vulnerable, so that's sometimes the risk of playing high risk with your tanks. So you can see if it gets encircled and then attacked, it may get cornered. If it gets cornered, it gets fully suppressed, regardless of what I do or not. However, you see these guys are still unsupplied. They have been able to break out the encirclement, but some tanks are left behind. And we're going to keep on pushing forward anyway, regardless. So we're going to attack this unit and move forward. And hopefully pull off another encirclement here. So they can't move across this tile, so once again I have successfully encircled the enemy. But they may break out, and so it's not only about encirclement, it's also about containing the enemy and preventing them from pushing over. So in this case, I should probably move this unit here to block it off. And that whole area is now blocked off. So we could waste our time trying to wear down these positions, or with our tanks, or we could keep on pushing ahead. Now, what we can do is use one of our tanks to hold this position, and now move forward with this tank here. Now, you see here we've got a small exclamation mark. That means this unit has been unsupplied for one turn. This means this unit can still attack, but next turn it won't be if it's still lacking supply, which it will be lacking supply. And then of course you see this unit here with a big exclamation point. That means it's gone 2 turns without supply. It's still got full steps, or still have the steps it has left, but it will not be able to attack. It will only be able to move. and that means that it's extremely vulnerable at this stage, and it's all about containing it and preventing it from moving forward. My HQ here, because it was encircled for 1 turn, has been unsupplied and therefore won't be able to use a lot of its special abilities or its reinforcement traits. But because we've contained the encirclement, they will not be able to break through unless they were able to break through this enemy, this position here, my friendly position. And then they might be able to withdraw some tanks across the line. And now we can continue to push forward. So we can play it risky and bomb Karu. Fully suppressing the fire. Allowing us to push. You get a spare card, which I very rarely use, but let's just demonstrate what this does. We can see now we've got the bonus cards we can, the bonus elite units we can use, which we can now use to upgrade our units, or the elite specialists we can use, which cost a lot of money, but normally won't, and are pretty chunky. So it's something I very rarely use. You don't need to use these, but it's a bit of a waste of a card. I would normally discard it, but hey ho, it's still spare points anyway. And then we take a look at our own supplies. You can see here that our units here will be out of supply, but hopefully you'll be able to use emergency resupply on them next turn. Now you can also use emergency resupply if it's to resupply certain steps. You can see this one suppressed, but only if it's lacking supply. So another meme sort of strat is to purposely put a damaged unit or a half suppressed unit out of supply so you can use the emergency resupply to resupply it quickly. But then again, it depends on the scenario. It depends on whether or not you've got 100% supply efficiency, 50% supply, whether or not it's an optimum strategy. And of course, we've now advanced. It's a pretty open and shut case now. It's a pretty easy scenario, and we can now move to Enderville. So depending again on the scenario, it depends on where you want to push. Certain maps will require you to use a hefty use of supply dumps and HQ reinforcements to push across open lands, such as Ukraine in the Barbarossa DLC. Others will be more inclined for you to push up rail lines. Of course, it depends. You have to look at the map, and then part of the beauty of the game will be thinking, okay, which is the best way to push? Okay, this open terrain looks very undefended using our binocular tab, which you cannot use because there's no user. So I will push across there, and then of course you've got to use supply. But I will normally look at a map, look at where its rail lines are, and then make the decision to either push along rail lines or try and encircle enemy rail lines. In this scenario, it's very easy. You've got 2 rail lines to follow. You don't really have to concern yourself too much. But we see here our unit is 1 turn out supply. Doesn't mean a lot right now because it's only out with 1 step. But it means the next turn, if we don't supply it now, that it will not be able to attack. It will only be able to move, and the 3rd turn without supply it will be fully suppressed. Like this, oh no, this unit's not fully out supply yet. Like this unit here, see that's gone really exclamation mark. This now means this is the 3rd turn unit troop, or the 3rd turn enemy unit that is now fully suppressed and completely vulnerable to attack. And over time, it will begin to lose steps to stragglers and people retreating because of the lack of supply. You can see here also we've got that big exclamation mark. Now means I can just mop up this unit, wear it down, and get 3 XP from destroying it. So I can do 2 things. I can either do the emergency resupply, which will then of course will partially reinforce it and make it capable of attacking, or carry on the assault. So now it will reset the lack of supply timer, meaning that I have now again 3 more turns before I'm in real trouble. Or I can take the enemy supply dump, and this will supply all nearby units, or most nearby units, and reinforce them again. But again, because this area is out of supply, it just resets the timer. So if I wanted to fix that, I would have to get rid of a supply point here, or upgrade my supply hub so it expanded to reach this area. Now supply hubs can only go up to level 5 supplied, and of course after a certain point it will still be too far away. So sometimes you want to go a turn without any supply like this, go next turn without any supply, and use that turn to put your supply hubs a bit closer. So in this case I'm going to take this supply hub and take out its supply, just to demonstrate what you can do to sort of improve your situation. And because I know most of these units are now supplied, that I know they can go one turn without supply. And so because I'll get rid of the supply dump, next turn I'll put it down somewhere else. So with this we can now chill out, or we can, if you want to end the scenario, take Infidavil now. We've got until turn 7, so we can sort of chill a bit. There's no real need to be so excessive, but again we'll just highlight some examples of what else we can do. So we can use our air attacks. It's always good because this sort of air attack will refresh every turn, so we can use this air attack to bomb away. And you can see some units having better chances of killing a tank than others, and so it will be to do with specialist steps, or be due to experience. So if I've got a lot of anti-tank specialist steps, like I believe this Ordnance QF 17 pounder, and it's quite an elite unit, it will be able to do some damage to an enemy unit. Equally, if it's got some artillery specialists and it hasn't moved, because if you move an artillery specialist it will be suppressed because artillery takes time to set up. So for example, we've got artillery in this step. If I move it, it's suppressed now. I've got 2 artillery actually in this step. I've moved it, it is now suppressed, and now therefore can no longer use, or no longer gets the benefits of its specialist steps. But next turn, as long as it's supplied, it will be able to use the benefits of its specialist steps. So depending on what steps you use can sometimes limit when they're useful, and sometimes it will take a bit more extra planning. So in this case, if I wanted to use them next turn, I'd move this troop off, move this troop on. Next turn my specialist steps are reinforced because they're in good supply, and then I get the full maximum potential from this unit. Of course, if I then move this unit again, they become suppressed, those tiles, and so they will not work. So for example, if I move this, my artillery unit is now suppressed, but my engineers are not. I move it back. Next turn, as long as it's supplied, the artillery step will reinforce, and I'll be able to get the most out of it. I've reached that position, which means then I'm no longer affected by the defense bonuses, and now I can move forward. So we've gone one turn without supply because I took rid of that supply hub. This means all these units are now going to have that one turn out of supply. It still means they can attack, this means they haven't been reinforced, but the next turn, if these guys are unsupplied, they won't be able to attack and they can only move. And then turn 3, they become fully suppressed and they begin to start losing their units. So you want to keep an eye on some of your straggling units sometimes. If you've got like a unit over here, you may want to move them to a rail line, because nothing hits worse than losing a good unit that's a bad supply. But because we closed down our supply hub, we now have 2 supply trucks we can put down. So we can put it down closer to the front and then go to that level 2. And now, because our supply hub is closer to the front, we will be within supply range for our tanks. From there, we can of course attack or use an emergency supply. I would generally recommend using an emergency supply when you get to out of supply 1 turn for your tanks, because if you're going to be constantly pushing forward with your tanks, there's no guarantee that they will be not encircled or not cut off from your HQs. So say in the Barbarossa DLC, this is when I would use an emergency resupply and keep on pushing your tanks forward. You don't want to be doing it on turn 2 because you lose an attack turn. So resupply, push forward, attack, move forward. Now there are some problems which we need to talk about. So if we take a look at these prisoners act like a temporary speed bump as well. So in some situations where time is of the essence, what can happen is if you're trying to move forward, prisoners will slow you down. And so you may want to use a slower less paced unit to take a prisoner to move your tanks forward. The same is for enemy HQs. An enemy HQ takes more actions or more movement to take a tile with an enemy HQ on it than it does if it was empty. And so an enemy HQ can potentially block you from winning your objectives within the time limit, or it can potentially just delay and stall you. So now you can see these guys are fully out of supply. They're getting a lot of stragglers. I can only move this far because there's so many prisoners on these positions, and now of course I can attack these positions and get experience to upgrade my units. Now you can, if you want, just allow the prisoners to sort of just leave these units starve to death. But I would normally recommend in most scenarios to attack, because you want to upgrade your experience in your units. And if you have the experience in your units, you should be pretty safe. You can see these 2 units would be out of supply, but it's not the end of the world, because next turn I should win this scenario. So if I wanted to connect this line up, now I've connected this rail line, I could also put down a supply hub here on this track, or this road. But let's finish this off. So this is a pretty bad wadi accurate scenario, or a pretty bad wadi accurate, which is a very beginner scenario, because I lost that 1 tank unit. Most of the time you would not be losing tank units. It's probably because I've just been showcasing some of the tutorial and some of the aspects of it. Also because I've been playing Moscow 41, where the mechanics of the game completely changed. It's no longer about preserving units, it's about just throwing troops in and just overwhelming your enemy with by dying, effectively, letting the German tanks get suppressed by killing all your units, and then counter-attacking and killing the enemy tank with your garbage troops. So, but this is just a good example of the mechanics of the game and things you can take into account. See if I can get an encirclement penalty for these guys. So if I can move this tank over. No. Sadly not. Sadly not. So I use Suppression tool to knock these guys out of Entrenchment. Sadly not, sadly not. We'll go one more turn to see if I can get you in Encirclement. Sometimes the enemy will have air and will bomb you. And again, it's a bit RNG. So because I've won the scenario, you can either keep on playing or choose not to, and carry on to the next scenario. I need to attack with something a bit weaker. Sadly not. I wonder if I can attack with something a bit weaker. No. Okay. Now there's one more thing I can potentially show you, which is a bit of an exploit. So, on the higher level scenarios, because the campaign is persistent, you can abuse the resupply system. So if I was to lose a unit like that tank unit, if it was used historically in the next scenario, it would be reconstituted or remade but weaker. What this means is that I would get a weaker version of it back to me. So what you can do is cheese the game, take all the armor steps, and then effectively do step recycling. And so the next turn I'll get that unit back reconstituted, and then of course I'll have all those 3 tank steps. At least that's how it works. I've never done it myself, but at least I believe that's how it works. It also allows you to do specialist step recycling, so if you don't know if that unit's going to be used in the next scenario, you can take these steps off and use it again. Again, you can only do it so much per turn, so bear that in mind. That you only have till turn 9 before the scenario ends, so you want to be doing that early on. And this means that, of course, you can use those specialist steps at a later date in a different scenario. Points to note is I've never done that myself. I never saw the point in doing it, and I think it probably wouldn't be very fun for you if you did do it. I think that's only for like the sort of hard and classic modes. For medium and easy, you don't need to do that, so don't worry about doing that. But that was a general tutorial on the different mechanics of the situation, talking about supply, talking about the supply penalty, talking about steps, talking about specialist steps, and of course talking about reinforcements and how combat works. You can see here that these guys are now out of supply for 2 turns, and so they can only move now, and if they're out of supply for the 3rd turn, they will become fully suppressed. So what would I say as some advice for some of the scenarios? So I don't really want to, I've done some playthroughs of them on medium and easy, but the things I would say is pay attention to what the game expects you to do, expects you to take by a certain turn period. This will normally be an indicator of where you want to push. So of course it told me that's the facts it wanted by turn 4, so it's a good indicator that it wants me to push there first. Take into account supply lines and supply routes. Now if most of your best units are on supply routes or bust, then you want to be pushing along those supply routes, especially if they eventually lead to an objective, because that means you don't have to worry about supply as much, and so on and so forth. Make sure your HQs are as close to your main pushing or most important units as possible, because it allows you to use special abilities and allows you to reinforce them. Make sure your specialists, make sure your headquarters are moving up along the line. Otherwise you end up with a situation where the enemy blows a bridge but you can't repair it that turn because your HQ is not close enough. Make sure that your HQs and supply hubs are protected, because the enemy can do Hail Mary assaults with their cavalry or their infantry, where they will send the sacrificial lamb to cut up your supply line and take your supply hubs. Make sure you're not losing troops to supply. Make sure they're not being make sure you're preserving them. If you're no longer using a troop or you don't intend to use a troop, move them to a supply line or move them onto a rail line and then reduce the supply you have in those areas. You can go 1 turn without supplies, so sometimes it's a good idea to starve your troops for 1 turn. An emergency resupply is your friend. Equally, enemy supply hubs are also a potential viable attack. Spacebar will save you in most situations, and only use your cards if you are in desperate need of them. Some scenarios, because the campaign is persistent, you'll potentially get weaker, especially if it's your first game, you'll potentially get weaker as the game goes on, and you may get to a scenario which you simply would not win without your cards, because you've gotten so weak because of the persistent campaign and the constant losses. So in this scenario, I lost a tank. That means my tanks will be weaker for the next scenario. It may mean I struggle in the next scenario, which means I may struggle in the scenario after that, and you can get quickly into a very bad snowball effect. So I would normally argue only use your planes or your cards if there's a particular alternative objective you want to take, or there's a particular scenario which you're really struggling on. You do not want to be caught out on a hard scenario like the Battle of the Bulge without any cards, or without any sort of bombers or anything like that, because you will end up being soft locked and you'll have to redo conferences or potentially redo the entire campaign. Very prominent in Barbarossa, where you start off with very good units that get very weak as the campaign progresses, especially if you keep on losing units. So it's very important that you are preserving your cards and not just using them willy-nilly. So in this scenario, I would not have used my card. And I probably would restart this scenario if I wasn't doing a tutorial. Anyway, that's the end of this tutorial. Pretty easy one, pretty easy starting scenario. One more point. Take a look at your turn limits, and the number of turns you have will normally give you an indication of the type of scenario you're playing. So if you've got objectives that are really close, like over here, but you've got 20 turns to take it, it's normally a good indicator that this is going to be an attritional scenario where you're going to be using artillery, airstrike, and slowly wearing down the enemy. However, if you've got a scenario where you've got, say, 9 turns to take your objective and your objective is all the way over there, it's normally a good indicator that it's going to be a blitzkrieg objective or a blitzkrieg scenario where you want to be moving your tanks up as far as possible. Of course, that's not always a given, and sometimes you need to replay the scenarios to find out what's the best route, which makes this game so great is its replayability. But it's just normally a good indicator of how the game wants you to play each scenario. Now, thank you for watching, boys. That's the end of this tutorial. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Again, I'm not an expert. I'll be honest with you, my use of elite reserves or specialist tabs tends to be engineers, most expensive artillery. My main priorities tend to be armor steps, engineers, most expensive artillery, and then the most expensive units after that for my main units. Now, if I've got a unit that is, say, only 3 strong and I've got spare points left over, I may invest in more infantry steps. But as a rule, it's armor steps first, engineers, artillery. And you normally won't go very far wrong unless you're playing Moscow 41, then it's just Katyushas and just meat grind until you die. But thank you all for watching, boys. Thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed. Adieu.